The name MKULTRA still drips with unease, a cipher for institutional betrayal and the weaponization of the human psyche. Though officially terminated in the 1970s, its legacy remains far from buried. Like a mythic spectre, it continues to haunt the corridors of power, not as a relic of Cold War paranoia, but as a blueprint refined, rebranded, and embedded in the scaffolding of modern psychological operations. To understand how MKULTRA persists today, one must first grasp its original architecture. A convergence of pharmacology, psychology, and covert experimentation designed to fracture and reassemble the human mind. MKULTRA was born in 1953, a product of the CIA's obsessive quest to control behavior, extract secrets, and engineer obedience. The program operated under the guise of national security, but its methods were anything but protective. LSD was administered in high doses to unwitting subjects, often in psychiatric hospitals or federal prisons. Electroshock therapy was weaponized, not for healing, but for erasure. Hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and induced amnesia were explored not as therapeutic tools, but as instruments of domination. The goal was not simply to interrogate it, was to dismantle identity, to override will, to create programmable minds. The scope of MKULTRA was staggering. Safe houses in New York and San Francisco became laboratories of psychological warfare. The Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, under Dr. Ewan Cameron, conducted experiments that left patients permanently damaged, many of whom had sought help for minor ailments. These were not isolated incidents, but part of a systemic pattern. The targeting of vulnerable populations under the pretense of research. When the program was exposed in the 1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKULTRA files, ensuring that only fragments would remain for public scrutiny. What survived was enough to confirm the horror, but not enough to trace its full lineage. Yet MKULTRA did not vanish. Its techniques, stripped of their original name, found new life in other programs, institutions, and paradigms. The use of psychedelics, for instance, has re-emerged in clinical trials for depression, PTSD, and addiction. While many of these studies are conducted ethically, some are funded by government agencies with histories of covert experimentation. The line between healing and manipulation remains thin, especially when consent is obscured by institutional authority. Sensory deprivation, once used to induce psychosis and stability, now appears in enhanced interrogation protocols and solitary confinement practices. Hypnosis and memory regression, once tools for erasing and implanting memories, are still explored in forensic psychology and interrogation training. The techniques have evolved, but their psychological architecture remains intact. Perhaps most troubling is the continued use of unwitting subjects. In MKULTRA's heyday, individuals were dosed with LSD without their knowledge, subjected to psychological torture, and left to navigate the aftermath alone. Today, ethical concerns persist in drug trials, behavioral studies, and surveillance-based research. The rise of biometric tracking and AI-driven behavioral analysis introduces new forms of experimentation, ones that do not require physical contact, but can still manipulate perception, emotion, and decision-making. The human mind remains the battleground, and the war is far from over. Recent document releases reveal that the CIA funded experiments through academic institutions and medical foundations well into the 1970s. These partnerships allowed covert research to masquerade as legitimate science, shielding it from public scrutiny. Today, over 70 U.S. universities are conducting trials with substances like LSD and MDMA. Some receive federal support, echoing MKULTRA's pharmacological roots. While many researchers are motivated by healing, the institutional scaffolding raises questions about oversight, consent, and the potential for abuse. The resurgence of psychedelic research is not inherently sinister, but its historical context demands vigilance. Veteran and prisoner populations, historically targeted for experimentation, remain vulnerable. Incarcerated individuals are often subjected to psychological studies with limited oversight. Veterans, especially those with PTSD, are recruited for trials that promise relief but may involve untested or controversial methods. These groups, already navigating trauma and systemic neglect, are offered hope, but sometimes at the cost of autonomy. The ethical terrain is complex, and the legacy of MKULTRA casts a long shadow over these practices. Beyond the clinical and institutional, MKULTRA's legacy lives on in the mythic psyche. It represents a rupture moment when the sovereign mind was treated as a commodity, a tool, a threat. The archetype is Prometheus bound, the fire of consciousness stolen and shackled by those who feared its power. For survivors and seekers, naming these patterns is an act of reclamation. It affirms that autonomy is not paranoia, it is sacred. The ability to discern, to question, to protect one's inner world is not a luxury, but a necessity in a landscape where control is often disguised as care. The psychological architecture of MKULTRA also informs modern propaganda, media manipulation, and digital surveillance. The techniques of fragmentation, repetition, and emotional overload once used in interrogation rooms now appear in algorithmic feeds and targeted content. The goal is not always overt control, but subtle influence, shaping perception through curated stimuli. The mind is still the target, and the tools are more sophisticated than ever. In this context, discernment becomes a form of resistance. To recognize the pattern is to disrupt it. To name the architecture is to dismantle it. The mythic dimension of MKULTRA also invites a deeper inquiry into the nature of healing. If the program sought to fracture identity, then healing must involve integration, sovereignty, and narrative reclamation. Survivors of institutional abuse often describe a process of remythologizing their experience, transforming trauma into story, chaos into meaning. This is not denial but alchemy. It is the act of turning lead into gold, of reclaiming the fire that was stolen. In this sense, MKULTRA becomes not just a historical scandal, but a portal, a mirror through which we confront the systems that seek to define us, and the inner fire that refuses to be extinguished. To move forward, we must demand transparency. Declassification efforts must continue, especially around current behavioral research. The public has a right to know how institutions are studying, influencing, and experimenting on human minds. This is not about paranoia, it is about accountability. The history of MKULTRA teaches us that secrecy breeds abuse, and that oversight is not optional. It is a moral imperative. We must also protect consent. Informed, voluntary participation must be the cornerstone of any psychological or pharmacological study. Vulnerable populations, children, prisoners, veterans, the mentally ill must be shielded from coercion and manipulation. Consent is not a checkbox, it is a sacred agreement rooted in autonomy and respect. When institutions violate this agreement, they do not simply break the law, they fracture the soul. Finally, we must reclaim narrative. Survivors and independent thinkers must be empowered to tell their stories, not as victims, but as myth-makers of a new paradigm. The act of naming, of speaking, of weaving experience into meaning is revolutionary. It disrupts the architecture of control and replaces it with a tapestry of truth. This is not just personal, it is collective. When one person reclaims their story, they create a ripple that challenges the entire system. MKULTRA is not over. Its name may be buried, but its techniques, its architecture, and its mythic resonance remain. To confront it is to confront the shadow of institutional power, the fragility of consent, and the sacredness of the sovereign mind. It is to say, we remember. We see, we refuse to be programmed, and in that refusal, we reclaim the fire.